They handed her a cardboard box and told her she was replaceable. They had no idea they had just fired the one person who controlled whether they would have jobs to come back to on Monday morning. Her name was Ava Sinclair, and for 18 months she had worked at Aurora Ventures, answering to people who never once bothered to ask who she really was, before they decided she wasn't worth keeping. On the day they let her go, 3 of the company's top executives stood behind a wall of glass, staring at a single sheet of paper with her photograph on it, and every one of them turned pale at exactly the same moment. Ava, meanwhile, walked out of that building calmly, box in hand, without raising her voice or explaining a single thing. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how she let them make that mistake, and why she waited until this exact moment to let them find out who she truly was. Aurora Ventures was a fast-growing investment firm, the kind of company that photographed well in business magazines and threw lavish year-end parties for clients who never noticed the people quietly running the numbers behind the scenes. Ava had joined as a mid-level analyst, unassuming, punctual, and by every account on paper, entirely unremarkable. She answered emails promptly, kept to herself in meetings, and never once mentioned that the modest apartment she came home to every night had nothing to do with the actual size of her bank account. What none of her colleagues knew, and what her supervisor Richard Colton certainly never bothered to find out, was that Ava held something far more valuable than a job title. She held a controlling stake in the very company that employed her, tucked quietly behind the name of a holding firm nobody in that building had ever thought to question. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a woman ends up firing the very executives who once fired her, you first need to understand 3 things. First, why would someone with Ava Sinclair's real financial power choose to sit quietly at a junior desk for 18 months, taking orders from people who had no idea who they were speaking to? Second, what exactly did Richard Colton and the leadership team fail to notice about her, right up until the moment it was far too late for that ignorance to protect them? And third, once the truth finally came out inside that boardroom, what did Ava actually do with the power she had been quietly holding onto the entire time? These are not simple questions with simple answers, and the story behind each one is stranger and more deliberate than anyone at Aurora Ventures could have imagined while they were busy deciding she wasn't worth keeping around. Richard Colton was the kind of executive who built his entire career on being noticed. He dressed the part, spoke the part, and measured every person around him by how useful they appeared to be in that exact moment. To him, Ava Sinclair was simply a name on a headcount report, an easy line item to cut when the board started asking uncomfortable questions about quarterly performance. He never once considered that the quiet analyst who rarely spoke up in meetings might be paying closer attention to the company's inner workings than anyone else in that building, including himself. That single assumption, that stillness meant weakness, that quiet meant powerless, would turn out to be the most expensive miscalculation of his entire career, though he wouldn't understand just how expensive until the day everything finally came into focus. Ava Sinclair had not always lived quietly. She grew up the only daughter of a man who built a small logistics company into a regional powerhouse over 3 decades of relentless, unglamorous work, the kind of business success that never made magazine covers but quietly generated enormous wealth. When her father passed away 6 years before the events of this story, Ava inherited not just his fortune, but his controlling interest in several private holdings, one of which had, through a series of investments made years earlier, become the largest single stake in a young, ambitious firm called Aurora Ventures. She could have stepped into a boardroom seat immediately. Instead, she made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She wanted to understand the company from the inside, not from a position of assumed authority, but from the desk of an ordinary employee, before deciding what kind of owner she wanted to be. Ava applied for the analyst position under her full legal name, which happened to differ slightly from the name attached to her father's holding company and public records, a small technicality that meant almost nothing to her personally and everything to how invisible she remained inside that building. She never lied about who she was. She simply never volunteered information nobody thought to ask for. Her colleagues assumed she was exactly what her resume suggested, a capable but unremarkable analyst, working her way up the same ladder as everyone else. She kept her apartment modest, her car practical, her wardrobe unremarkable, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to see, honestly and without interference, how a company like Aurora Ventures actually treated the people it considered replaceable. What she found, over 18 months of quiet observation, unsettled her more than she expected. She watched talented employees get passed over for promotions in favor of executives' personal favorites. She watched budget cuts hit support staff while leadership bonuses remained untouched. And she watched Richard Colton in particular, a man whose charm functioned almost entirely as a performance for anyone above him in the org chart, while his treatment of anyone below him grew colder by the month. Ava said nothing. She took notes, quietly, methodically, the same careful discipline her father had taught her to apply to any investment worth taking seriously. She was no longer simply observing a company she owned a piece of. She was beginning to understand exactly what kind of leadership that company actually had, and exactly what would need to change. The pressure at Aurora Ventures had been building for months before it finally reached Ava's desk. A major client had pulled their account after a mishandled quarterly report, and the board, uneasy about the firm's growth numbers, began asking pointed questions about efficiency and headcount. Richard Colton, eager to demonstrate decisive leadership before the next board meeting, looked for a fast, visible solution, and his eyes settled on the department Ava worked in. Cutting analyst positions was, in his calculation, a low-risk move. Analysts rarely had allies among senior leadership, rarely made noise when let go, and rarely had the standing to push back. Ava Sinclair, quiet and unassuming for 18 straight months, fit every category on his list perfectly. He never once considered checking further. The morning Richard called Ava into his office, he had already decided how the conversation would go. He spoke in the practiced, falsely sympathetic tone executives use when they have made a decision and simply need it to be over quickly. He cited restructuring, cited performance metrics that had nothing to do with her actual work, and slid a folder across his desk containing severance paperwork he expected her to sign without argument. Ava listened without interrupting. She did not defend herself. She did not raise her voice. She simply nodded once, thanked him for his time in a tone that gave away nothing, and asked only one question before standing to leave. She asked whether he was certain this was the decision he wanted to make. Richard, mistaking her calm for defeat, told her yes, without a second thought. What Richard did not know, standing in his office feeling satisfied with how smoothly the conversation had gone, was that the analyst walking out with a small box of desk items held more power over his career than the entire board of directors he was so anxious to impress. Word of Ava's departure spread quickly through the office that afternoon, the way these things always do, though nobody outside of Richard's immediate circle thought much of it beyond a passing comment. It was to everyone watching an unremarkable end to an unremarkable employee's time at the company. And that, more than anything else, is exactly how Ava had always planned for that moment to look, right up until it stopped looking that way entirely. Within 48 hours of walking out of Aurora Ventures, Ava was sitting across from her legal and financial advisors, a team her father had assembled years earlier, and one that had been quietly monitoring the company's performance from a respectful distance ever since her employment began. She laid out what she had personally witnessed over the past 18 months, not just her own termination, but a documented pattern of decisions that prioritized executive comfort over the health of the company and the well-being of its employees. Her advisors, who had long expected Ava might eventually choose to formalize her position within Aurora Ventures, asked her a simple question. Did she want to move quietly, adjusting leadership through standard board procedure, or did she want Richard Colton and his team to fully understand, in real time, exactly what their decision had cost them? Meanwhile, back at Aurora Ventures, life continued as though nothing significant had happened. Richard reported the headcount reduction to the board as a proactive efficiency measure, a small win he was eager to take credit for ahead of the next quarterly review. A few colleagues who had worked closely with Ava privately felt the decision had been handled carelessly, but nobody raised it formally, and within a week her desk had already been reassigned to someone else. Nobody at the company noticed the modest but steady administrative requests beginning to move through the holding company that controlled the largest single stake in Aurora Ventures. Requests for updated financial disclosures, governance documents, and a formal review of executive decision-making over the previous fiscal year. To anyone without the full picture, it looked like routine investor diligence. It was, in fact, the opening move of exactly what it appeared to be. 3 weeks after Ava's termination, Aurora Ventures' general counsel received a formal notice requesting an emergency meeting with the company's largest shareholder, a holding entity the legal team recognized immediately by name, though not, at first, by the identity of the individual who controlled it. Richard Colton was informed of the meeting the following morning. Told only that it concerned governance matters the board needed to address promptly. He assumed, as he assumed most things, that this was an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership once again in front of the people who mattered most to his career. He had no reason yet to connect this meeting to the quiet analyst he had let go 3 weeks earlier. That connection was about to become impossible to ignore. The boardroom at Aurora Ventures was arranged for what everyone expected to be a straightforward governance review. Chairs positioned around the long glass table. The board members and senior executives, including Richard Colton, seated and ready to present updates on the company's direction. When the door opened and Ava Sinclair walked in, dressed exactly as she always had been, calm and unhurried, several people in that room assumed, for a brief and confused moment, that a former employee had somehow wandered into the wrong meeting. That confusion lasted exactly as long as it took the company's general counsel to introduce her, not as a former analyst, but as the controlling principal behind the holding company that owned the largest single stake in Aurora Ventures. The silence that followed was the kind that only happens when an entire room realizes, all at once, that everything they believed about a situation was wrong. Richard Colton's expression shifted through several stages in the span of a few seconds: confusion, disbelief, and finally something closer to dawning horror as he began connecting the past 18 months in his mind. Ava did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She calmly laid out what her review of the company's leadership decisions over the previous year had revealed, citing specific examples, specific dates, and specific choices that had prioritized short-term appearances over the long-term health of the company and its people, including the termination that had, quite directly, led to this exact meeting. What made the moment land as hard as it did wasn't anger, it was precision. Ava had not come into that boardroom seeking a dramatic confrontation. She had come with documentation, patience, and 18 months of first-hand observation that no outside consultant could ever have gathered. She informed the board that effective immediately, she would be exercising her full voting rights as controlling shareholder, and that a formal review of executive leadership, starting with Richard Colton's department, would begin that same week. Richard opened his mouth to respond, to offer some version of the same practiced explanations he had once given her across his own desk, and found, for the first time in his career, that he had absolutely nothing convincing left to say. Richard Colton did not lose his position through a dramatic public firing. The formal review Ava initiated took place over the following weeks, methodical and thorough, examining not just her own termination, but the broader pattern of decisions that had shaped the department under his leadership. The findings were clear enough that Richard chose to resign before the board could vote on his removal, a quieter ending than the one he had once given Ava, though considerably less generous in its consequences for his future career. Other executives who had built their standing on the same culture of image over substance found their positions reviewed as well, and several departed in the months that followed, as Aurora Ventures began the slow, uncomfortable process of examining exactly what kind of company it had allowed itself to become. Ava did not use her new authority to seek personal retribution beyond what the facts themselves demanded. Instead, she used her position to change the structure of the company from the inside, implementing new protections for employees facing restructuring decisions, requiring documented justification for terminations, and creating channels for staff concerns that had never meaningfully existed under the previous leadership. It was, in its own quiet way, a far more lasting form of consequence than a single dramatic confrontation could ever have delivered. The employees who had once watched a quiet, unremarkable analyst get walked out with a cardboard box slowly came to understand that the culture they had all been navigating in silence was finally beginning to shift beneath their feet. Was justice truly served here? Richard Colton lost his career, but faced no legal consequence beyond that, since nothing he had done technically broke any law, only revealed exactly the kind of leader he had chosen to be when he believed no one who mattered was watching closely enough. Some will call Ava's approach the ultimate quiet victory, proof that patience and documentation can accomplish what anger alone never could. Others might wonder whether a system that allows this kind of harm to happen so easily in the first place is the real problem worth examining. What remains clear is this: Ava Sinclair spent 18 months being underestimated by people who never once thought to ask who she really was, and when the moment finally came, she made sure they understood exactly what that mistake had cost them. What do you think? Would you have handled it the way Ava did, staying quiet and patient until the moment was right, or would you have revealed the truth the second they tried to walk you out the door? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if this story resonated with you, wait until you hear about the next case, involving an employee who uncovered something about her own company that no one, not even the board, had any idea was happening right under their noses. Subscribe now so you never miss the next real story of power, patience, and the people who are far more capable than anyone gave them credit for.